Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Greg Bluestein here with Washington Bureau Chief Tia Mitchell, live and in person, at least in the studio in person.
In the flesh.
In the flesh, I should say. For years, establishment Democrats have warned that the party's progressive wing can energize activists and win safe districts, but risks losing the swing voters needed to capture power. Michigan Democrats just put that theory to one of its biggest tests yet. Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, a progressive former public health official who had never held elected office, narrowly defeated Congresswoman Haley Stevens for the Democratic nomination for an open U.S. Senate seat in Michigan. Stevens had the backing of Michigan's Democratic establishment and made electability central to her campaign. El-Sayed offered voters an unabashedly progressive agenda and a critique of the status quo. Now comes the harder part. El-Sayed must prove that the coalition that carried him through a Democratic primary can also win a general election in a state Donald Trump carried twice. Sounds familiar, right? The result has implications, of course, far beyond Michigan, including here in Georgia, where Democrats are often debating how to motivate younger and more diverse voters without losing the swing vote who helped turn the state purplish. Joining us now is State Representative Ruwa Romman, a former gubernatorial contender and a Democratic nominee for an open Gwinnett County State Senate seat, who spent the last week or so in Michigan. We're going to talk about what Michigan tells us, what it doesn't, and whether Georgia progressives have a realistic pathway to statewide power. Hey, Representative.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's nice to be back here.
So answer all those questions for us
right now. Immediately.
No, but what should an election in Michigan tell us about Georgia? Because the Democratic coalition in Michigan is so different than the Democratic coalition that powers elected officials like you here in Georgia.
Yeah, I think the thing that made me most curious about Michigan isn't actually my shared identity with Abdul. Obviously, he's also Arab. He's also Muslim. He even has some Palestinian background. What made me extremely intrigued about what's happening in Michigan is the particular concept of the many versus the money. Those that have followed our election have heard that phrase before. And the reason it's so incredibly important is that we are up against a lot of money here in Georgia. Rick Jackson just bought $87 million worth of ads with his own money. That doesn't even include what the party could potentially be putting in. That could be coordinated money per the recent SCOTUS ruling. And so for us, it was really important to see the kind of strategies they were deploying to be able to fight back against what ended up being almost $80 million worth of spending against Abdul.
You talked about the many versus the money. And we're hearing a lot of Democrats, establishment Democrats, I guess you would call them, saying they're worried that candidates like El-Sayed, candidates like you, if we're going to be honest, are pulling the party too far left and getting away from candidates who can be electable in a general election in swing states like Michigan and Georgia. Why do you think they're wrong?
I firmly believe they are wrong because at some point we are going to have to look at around us and realize that we have failed. We have failed voters everywhere. And it's not just, in Michigan, it's everywhere. The reason we're seeing the kind of backlash around the country to the quote unquote establishment, I like to prefer the term institutionalists, those that are more focused on the institution than the actual building of infrastructure in the party. We haven't been able to deliver for them. And not only that, we've now lost against Trump, not just once, but twice. The other thing about electability that I find really interesting is that I do not understand why a candidate that had, again, $80 million spent on her behalf and still lost is more electable than an individual who built an entire field program, was all around the state, and had been able to eke out a win in the end of someone that no one thought was going to win when he first started his campaign. And so when we consider electability, at the end of the day, it's who won the election? Right now, it's Abdul. I actually think that he is uniquely capable of hitting back against Mike Rogers because he's bringing back people that we lost in 2024.
We like to get into the nitty-gritty in this show. So what did you learn on the ground in Michigan? What styles, what campaign strategies were employed there that you might see in Georgia in the not-so-distant future?
There are multiple things. There's the typical media. So he was going literally on every platform that would have him. But in addition to that, they were leveraging social media incredibly well to then use that to bring more people into the campaign, which they then mobilized to knock over 200,000 doors in the primary. Abdul himself held almost 500 events around Michigan and all over Michigan. It wasn't just in the metro areas.
A lot of Upper Peninsula events.
Literally everywhere. And so for those who aren't familiar with Michigan, everyone knows the Mitten. They don't they always forget there's sort of a little northern part there as well. And the only reason I know is that, stereotypically I have an uncle who lives in Michigan. And so I got to learn a lot about Michigan as I was growing up. But the other piece to his campaign was they were very receptive to people. They did not care who you were. It was just, if you care about, money in your pocket, money out of politics, Medicare for all, which kind of became his chant and slogan throughout this campaign, you were welcome into that fold. And I think we've forgotten that kind of coalition building around specific issues that we can all agree on.
So that's one thing that I found surprising, and we're going to just get to, because I know I made you mad. You've seen a clip of me on CNN, and
Not
it made
mad,
you
just
mad.
concerned.
Let's give the listeners background.
Yeah, so I was on CNN a week or so ago, and we were talking, this was before the primary, and we were talking about electability. And again, this keeps coming up, not just with El-Sayed, but with other progressive candidates, that they can win primaries, but can they win a general? And the clip that you might not have seen is I said, well, he's likely going to win. He's leading in the polls. He's reaching out to voters. I said, but when you ask about electability, I do think some of the hand-wringing, and I might not have said this as articulately as I'm saying it now, but some of the hand-wringing goes beyond, to me, concerns about his message, because I do think when you look at his website and you listen to what he's saying, most people go, I agree with what most of the guy is saying. So if that's the case, then the electability has to be about more than that to me. And I said it has to do, to me, with some people think because he's Muslim, because he has he's Arab and is a person of color, that some people, I think that gives them pause about whether he is electable. And so I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about that? How much of a barrier do you think that's just like an old way of thinking and those aren't true barriers anymore? What are your thoughts?
I think everyone has barriers. And for some candidates, they could be different. Again, Haley Stevens is a woman. There could be an argument made that because she's a woman going up against a man, that she has something going against her. We've heard arguments about people's age. They're too old, they're too young. But we also have people who have had scandals and have either weathered those scandals or lost as a result of those scandals. And my challenge to those who are trying to figure out where we go in this political wilderness is, look at how people are running their elections. Start looking under the hood instead of just what you are being told about a candidate. It's exactly what you said. If you listen to Abdul, he actually sounds like your very stereotypical, actually middle-of-the-road Democrat. It's really fascinating to me that he is being called sort of a leftist, a socialist, whatever people have been calling him, because as someone who's had conversation with him and actually, like you said, listened to what he says, it's been surprising to me, these conversations around electability. And again, if his identity is an issue, that is heard. I do not dismiss concerns about, somebody's identity potentially impacting what they are able to do. But my question is that what is the likelihood that we were going to get those voters anyway? Because there is actually a strong correlation and overlap between those that will see a candidate insert identity here and saying, I'm never going to vote anyway. Those people hate Democrats. They're less likely to vote for them. Those are not the fence sitters. Those are not the people willing to hear from others. And so I challenge folks about that. Again, Barack Hussein Obama was president, right? Not just for one term, but 2 terms, one of the most popular in our history. We have had, I point to my own district. My district is actually not sort of a bastion in the city of Atlanta. It is a suburban district and actually more swingy than my state house district now. And so again, I encourage folks to look at not just the candidate type and their characteristics, but what is under the hood and how they're dealing with those issues.
Yeah, and look, El-Sayed might be able to relate to middle-of-the-road voters, but he also is a proud progressive, right? And let's bring it to Georgia, because it is in Republicans' best interest to go and paint all Democratic nominees as far left, socialist. We've seen this. This is not the first cycle we've seen this. This has happened the last, 20 cycles. It feels like it's been a long time. But if you look at the party's top nominees, John Ossoff, of course, has a liberal voting record. He votes with the Democratic Party on pretty much every priority, but he is middle of the road enough to have gotten endorsements from pretty prominent Republican officials, including 2 mayors just the other day. Keisha Lance Bottoms, the Democratic nominee for governor, she's far more mainstream than other candidates, including you. You ran for governor as the more progressive alternative, and she's the one who won. So when you look at Georgia, it seems like the more mainstream wing of the party is prevailing right now.
Yeah, so I don't see them as in conflict with each other. So when you look at our platform, when I ran for governor, one of the key issues we talked about was pressing pause on data centers. And if you actually look back and watch, there was a point where that is actually what Mayor Bottoms took on. That is actually something she incorporated into her platform. And it's not something that is out of the ordinary or progressive. Part of the thing about sort of this conversation about, left versus right, far left, far right, et cetera, is it sometimes misses issues that are what I call cross-partisan. They actually go beyond party lines. So in the case of Mayor Bottoms, for example, I actually think the reason she was able to win without a runoff is actually her position on data centers. There's a lot of concern about these things that are coming in, raising our utility rates, but also helping to take our jobs. They are causing long-term permanent consequences to the communities that they end up in. Similarly with Senator Ossoff, and people have heard me kind of really nerd out about this, constituent services matters. And oftentimes, doing your job is the best thing you can do for electability. If you were to ask those mayors, do they share the same values as the senator? Do they see themselves agreeing with him on 90% of other things? I'm willing to bet they're going to say no.
I didn't. They said no.
Yeah. And so
but it was constituent services in a major part that
and that's their job.
Those two, yeah.
That is their job. Their job is to give to their communities. And I think this is the part that I think matters the most is, are we putting people above the special interest and the politicking of it all? And again, they've been calling us socialists for 30 years now. And we rank almost last in healthcare. We rank almost last in quality of life. We rank almost last in wages and worker protections. And so something's got to give. And it's been 30 years of this Republican rule, and it's time to end it. And anyone willing to work with that coalition to make life better for Georgians is welcome into that coalition.
So that brings me to a couple of questions. And I don't know which one I want to start with, but I'll start with this one, the Democratic Socialists, which you're not one.
Mm-mm.
And El-Sayed is not one either. However, he has been endorsed by Democratic Socialists, and other candidates who identify as Democratic Socialists have won smaller races in Georgia and other states, even some congressional primaries. And when you look they just released a big policy platform, and Republicans pounced because it does say things. It doesn't just say abolish ICE. It's like abolish ICE and open up the borders. We want much more open and free immigration. It says Medicare for all, and it doesn't say if you like your insurance, you keep your insurance. It does not. It basically says create a single payer, one federally controlled insurer. And these are two examples. There are others that I think a lot of people would say, now this is too far, and it ain't just Republicans saying it. So some of this hand-wringing, when we go back to the electability question, is about, will the rise of Democratic Socialists specifically, or progressives more generally, pull the Democratic Party in a direction that they will lose people? Because they are pushing. It's not just about optics. It's about actual policies that they're pushing that will not be popular.
Yeah, when we are part of parties, there are these platforms that we either agree on or disagree on. And I don't think DSA is any different than any of that dynamic, right? Even the candidates who are endorsed by DSA, Zohran Mamdani is a very famous example of this. He is not only a DSA member, he's endorsed by New York City DSA, but most famously was not endorsed by the national DSA platform. And so there's a reason for that. I think that for a lot of these DSA members, it's kind of become a way to organize effectively that parties have been really failing on, I think, in the past couple of cycles in particular, where people are finding political homes there because we talk about pulling, the Democratic Party left. The reality is that the Democratic Party has also been pulled right as a result of the rise of Trump and the far right and the MAGA movement. But the times that we win are the ones that where we're laser focused on affordability issues, and not just as a buzzword, but specifically on wages, rising healthcare costs, rising utility costs, which requires an anti-institutionalist sort of framing to it. And so, yes, are they going to present, platforms on a national level? I'm not a part of those conversations. What I can say as a candidate myself, who I welcome people into the coalition who are committed to working on the things that make life better for Georgians. Republicans are really good about making controversies out of something that isn't there. They have flat out lied. Most famously, recently, Mike Collins said that Senator Ossoff voted against the Laken Riley Act, even though he had voted for it at the time, to the great anger of so many in our coalition. And clearly, it doesn't actually pan out. And so at some point, we also have to recognize that this is not good faith. No matter what we do or how far right or center we move, we're still going to be lied about, but we're not delivering for constituents. And so I would much rather deliver for constituents, build that trust, and continue to win in the future.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the trajectory of the Democratic Party going into Georgia's midterm elections. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. Greg Bluestein here with Washington Bureau Chief Tia Mitchell here in studio. Before we move on, a quick note. Politically Georgia is powered by subscribers to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. If you already subscribe, a hearty thank you. And if you don't, you can join us at ajc.com/start. You'll get full access to our reporting, analysis, subscriber newsletters, and special events. We've got a few coming up throughout this election year. That's ajc.com/start. Okay, we're here with State Representative Ruwa Romman, a proud subscriber of the AJC.
Yes, I am.
Put you on the spot. We want to play some audio that Tia collected just the other day at the congressional luncheon in Athens. It's with State Senator Josh McLaurin. He's the Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor. He's also known as one of the more progressive members of the Democratic caucus in the state Senate. And Tia asked him about the DSA movement and if it's gaining traction in Georgia. Here's what he said.
We're not in a position to go in some, crazy direction in Georgia. It's just not going to happen. The next 5 years are going to be clearing the desk of all the obvious policies that Republicans have been stonewalling for the last 10 to 20 years, like ensuring that rural health care survives, ensuring that we have the most basic protections for civil rights and for our public schools, right? Stuff that 70% plus of voters can get behind is what Georgia Democrats, we've been sharpening our focus for those 20 years, and that's where we start. So we're not even having the conversation about anything that's happening in Michigan or California or New York. That's not Georgia.
Since we're here with Representative Romman, you're, of course, not a member of the DSA, as Tia mentioned just a few moments ago, but there is a movement that is gaining, it seems to be not going in a quote-unquote crazy direction, maybe like Senator McLaurin said, but there are signs of it growing in Georgia council, state legislature, gaining some seats. And one of the risks for Democrats, of course, is Republicans painting several of those members as the face of the Democratic Party. It really hasn't happened in the way that I thought it might happen with Gabriel Sanchez's victory a few years ago, but it could. Is that a concern for Democrats that the DSA kind of becomes the new imprint of the Democratic Party?
I would challenge everybody in this political moment to ask themselves why DSA is surging and why they are getting the support that they are getting. Because if you look, their membership numbers are up. They are able to sway elections. They are able to be a key partner in that coalition. And when you look at what they are fighting for in particular and what makes them extremely popular, it is actually healthcare. It's things like healthcare. It's things like wages. It's things
and they're
like
pushing for universal healthcare.
Exactly. And look, I actually find it incredibly fascinating that it is the extreme position to push for universal healthcare at a time when people are struggling to make ends meet. We now have over 500,000 Georgians who've been rolled off of healthcare that cannot afford it, whether it's because of the ACA subsidies that Mike Collins voted to end, or because of the failing sort of project that says that, if you make healthcare for profit, it'll somehow magically work out. Nobody can make a decision to not buy their insulin, right? That is not the market forces that everyone keeps saying works, doesn't work. And I want to be abundantly clear here. My aunt in Jordan, who passed away, got better state-of-the-art healthcare than most people I know in the United States. And so folks love to paint these things as extremes. When you talk to average, everyday Georgians, they go, yeah, why is healthcare a for-profit entity and all of that kind of stuff? So going back to the main question, you have, for example, City Council member Kelsey Bond, who in the span of their short term so far has been able to deliver for their constituents very effectively and is now a trusted voice among Atlanta residents. Even when you mentioned State Representative Gabe Sanchez, he continues to show up with clear town halls, will actually engage with his community. What I urge everybody across the entire political spectrum to do is not get into these intellectual debates that frankly most voters do not have time for and are exhausted by. But ask yourselves, what are they wanting and what are they asking for? And why is this happening? And I would recommend curiosity instead of, for example, now spending $15 million like we saw this morning, that Third Way is now committing $15 million to go after DSA. Doesn't it make more sense to ask yourself, why is this happening and can we win people over? Because y'all, people are desperate right now.
So I want to pivot just a little bit, if you guys would indulge me. Before I said I was struggling because I had another question I really wanted to ask you. And it's about, we're talking about within the Democratic Party, some ideological differences, or maybe not even as much ideological, but differences in approach and messaging. And one of the things, we've seen this with Republicans, and it's caused a lot of headaches for Speaker Johnson, Speaker McCarthy before him, the fact that there were farther right, hard right members who could, really make things difficult with slim majorities because they disagreed with the rest of the party. And there's some of this hand-wringing about electability is not really about can these people get elected, but what havoc they could wreak if they do get elected and go to Congress and Democrats are in the majority, but they have these harder, farther left, more progressive members that don't want to go along to get along with the more moderate members of the party. Tell me about, I want you to address the fact that there could be this split, there could be some gridlock, there is concern that the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, could get in the way of good because some people have a vision for what great they should aspire to, and that could really, really cause headaches for Democrats if they get the majority.
Right now Republicans control every branch of government on a state and federal level, so clearly those headaches were beneficial to them, unfortunately, because at the end of the day, we do live in an attention economy, and I think this is actually a tension I personally have to deal with all the time because I am the oldest of four, a rule follower, somebody who has always believed that if you just put your head down and work really hard, it's going to work out. That's no longer the reality in politics. You can pass the greatest piece of legislation, and if you're not able to communicate about it, if you're not able to create a story and a narrative about why it matters, somebody else will. And when we talk about this gridlock, as a very famous example, President Biden had Build Back Better, this incredible piece of legislation that would have protected a lot of people during COVID and helped even more. I get Republicans love to talk about inflation, but I want to be clear, there was inflation around the entire world. Right now, we're under chosen inflation by this president with the Iran war, where my gas is now costing me sometimes up to $20 or $30 more to fill up. And so it's important to recognize that oftentimes in politics, we love to do this both sides thing, but I don't actually think there's any equivalent because even with Build Back Better, we had the Problem Solvers Caucus, most famously, that chose to take out key components of Build Back Better, including the EITC, and rolled people off of healthcare. So that way, when they were asked, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? 500,000 Georgians said no because we rolled them off of healthcare at the time. And guess what? Those Problem Solver Caucus members that we continue to see as these frontline protected at all costs are the same people that have resulted in us losing key portions of our coalition. I think Manchin is a perfect example of this. He at the time famously said he cannot support the extension of the EITC, which literally put more money in people's pockets.
And that was the earned income tax credit that was extra money for lower income families.
Right. These are working families. And I will never forget reading stories about people saying that for the first time, instead of having to work 3 jobs or 4 jobs, they can work 2. And for the first time, took their kids to the park, got to spend time with their children. And so it's important to understand what we are trading off and what we actually opened up space to, because again, Republicans now control all 4 branches of government, and we weren't able to put the narrative forward at the risk of these frontline Democrats. I would venture to say that if you deliver for your communities and your constituents, we've seen overperformers all around the country. What makes them overperformers isn't actually ideology. It's actually specifically how effective are you at your job, and are you able to message on that effectiveness? And as we've seen with Senator Ossoff, again, his constituent services are unmatched.
Representative, before we wrap up, let's talk about the race for governor because many Democrats see Keisha Lance Bottoms is running, Mayor Bottoms is running a more center-left campaign. But you did have a much more progressive candidate in Stacey Abrams running the last 2 election cycles, someone who had a more progressive policy agenda, who built a national organizing model. What lessons do you think progressives in particular in Georgia can take from her 2 defeats?
Yeah, I mean, the second one, it's important to remember that that was the year I call the year of incumbents, where there weren't really a lot of major losses and a lot of major wins in 2022, right? I mean, she lost by the smallest margin against an incumbent of any statewide election that year. And in 2018 in particular, she built something that did not exist in Georgia. And I think it's extremely important, again, to look back and recognize, was it ideology or was it how she was painted? Because oftentimes when I look at both platform positions, I'm just like, this is so normal. Like, it's just basic, expand Medicaid and maybe raise the minimum wage. And while we're at it, like, how can we help small businesses? And I think there was a point where she was messaging on the importance of paying police officers more. And so when folks talk about far left, et cetera, I think it's important to recognize that what Mayor Bottoms is doing is she is actually just picking up what we hear from Georgians and figuring out where, for example, these things overlap across geography, across economic status, across race, across age. And as we've mentioned, it's healthcare, it's data centers, it's people's wages not going as far as they used to go, but it's also how do we continue to maintain this job growth in Georgia, because we've given the tax credits, right? And we've now lost the film industry, and Hyundai is now expected to replace many of those jobs with robots by 2028. So what does sustainable economic growth look like that isn't just smoke and mirrors where we can say, we're the number 1 place to do business. And then next thing you know, folks are really struggling to make ends meet because we are literally sacrificing Georgians for that moniker without actually getting the benefits we were promised in return. And I think that's what Mayor Bottoms is focused on.
Representative, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you found us on YouTube, welcome to our channel. And please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. You can also follow the Politically Georgia podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any podcast platform. And if you have got a question for us on Georgia politics, you can call our hotline anytime, record your question, we'll play it back and answer it on our next Monday mailbag episode. The number is 770-810-5297 or politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.